Okay, there we go. Good evening. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy, City University of New York, Medgar Evers College. I am O. Felix Obi, and I'll be your instructor for this class and for the rest of the semester. So again, welcome to Module 2, Week 2. And I hope you now know from this week's assessment that today's lecture will be on barriers to trade. This topic is even more salient with recently announced U.S. trade tariffs against Mexico and Canada, which has now been postponed, and against China, which is still on. The learning objectives for this module is to understand why there can be barriers to trade, despite broad acknowledgement that trade is beneficial to all trading partners. And as we interrogate this paradox between acceptance that trade is good and yet resistance towards international trade, we will identify the different constituencies nationally and internationally that attempt to limit trade. Let me add that I hope you have all heard that President Trump imposed, then postponed 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico with a lower tariff rate of 10% on Canadian oil. And they still on 10% on imports from China. It is important to distinguish the rationale for President Trump's tariff from traditional resistance to international trade. So this is not President Trump trying to argue that international trade is not good for the United States. This is President Trump using tariff to achieve other policy objectives. So, as I said, it should be noted that prior to President Trump's suspension of tariffs, Canada indeed had announced a retaliatory tariff, initially targeting 20 billion in goods imported from the US, with tariffs of 25% to come into force February 4th, including beverages, cosmetics, and paper products. A second Canadian tariff list targeting 85 billion in goods would have also been implemented after public consultation. The second tariff list was to include passenger vehicles, trucks, steel, and aluminum products, certain fruits and vegetables, beef, pork, dairy products, and more. There's a reason why Canada had also threatened a retaliatory tariff against the United States. And Mexico was about to announce retaliatory tariffs, except President Trump now suspended the tariff, and Mexico announced that it will reciprocate by also suspending at least for 30 days the tariffs that it was going to impose on US goods. Meanwhile, China has signaled its intention to challenge US tariffs through the World Trade Organization. There's a reason why I'm laying down these markers. So in the weeks ahead, we will get to further interrogate the World Trade Organization and how it works and why China has signaled an intent to challenge US tariff at the WTO. That's also the acronym for World Trade Organization. So China claims that US tariffs seriously violate World Trade Organization rules. So by next week, we are going to start delving into WTO. But in addition to China's intended complaints to WTO, China has now also imposed tariffs on about $20 billion of their annual imports from the United States, with about 12% of the total, which is a far cry from the more than 450 billion Chinese goods targeted by the US. Notably, China's counter tariffs are fairly modest, at least relative to US tariffs, and appear calibrated to try to send a message to the US and domestic audiences without inflicting too much damage. So in the weeks ahead, we are going to start making ourselves familiar with basic concepts in international trade and international relations, such as a rules-based international order, which is institutions that govern global economic and political engagement. A major one, of course, is the World Trade Organization. And the rules governing trade is articulated through the WTO and is also a conflict resolution mechanism. So it is worth noting that even President Trump acknowledges that some economic pain will come if and when his tariffs take effect. Indeed, President Trump's tariffs are not intended to correct non-market trade practice, but instead, according to President Trump, tariffs were issued through International Emergency Economic Powers Act to address the major threats posed by illegal aliens and deadly drugs crossing American borders, especially fentanyl. Demonstrably, ongoing tariffs is not an outcome of conventional economic competition between states. Here's what I mean by that. Typically, states engage in what is called non-market economic practice. When states engage in non-market economic practice, the country they're trading with would impose tariffs. A major example of a non-market economic practice is subsidy. When a state subsidizes, and we will get into subsidy and market distortions in the weeks ahead, but let's say a company is making shoes, but it's running a loss. It cannot figure out a way to make those shoes profitably. And instead of that company going under, that way that country can import shoes from countries who can make shoes efficiently. That country chooses to subsidize that company. That is, keep paying the workers, keeping the lights on, despite the fact that they're not making profits. If that country chooses to sell those shoes overseas, that country will be assumed to be practicing non-economic trade practice. And the country they ship those shoes to would impose a tariff. That is to say, before you bring this shoe in, you got to pay 10% of what the value is, or 15%, or in the case of President Trump, 25%, or as suggested by President Trump. That is not what's going on here. What's going on here is that at least President Trump doesn't allege that Canada or Mexico are engaged in non-market economic practices. What he, however, alleges is that the two countries are not doing enough to stem illegal migration and to stem flow of illicit drugs into the United States. And he wants to punish them economically until they take steps to tighten the border. And that's his position. The problem with this strategy, of course, is that when you impose tariffs, it increases the cost for Americans. Companies typically don't eat the cost, absorb the cost of tariffs. So as one example, with the tariff he's placed on China, I would bet you money that in the next 3 months, cost of every cell phone will be higher. Or at least you will no longer see sales or deals on cell phones because it will not cost more to get them into the United States. So the American consumer is who would ultimately pay the price. But it gets even worse. Those countries would also impose tariffs on the importation of American goods. In the case of Canada, Canada was going to place tariffs on the importation of US agricultural products, among others. And this would have made it more challenging for US farmers and also place tariffs on US trucks. So what would happen is simultaneously, Many Americans could lose their jobs, even as the price for all Americans, the price that all Americans pay for goods and services that are coming from China, or had Canada and Mexico also been tariffs, goods that come from those countries would also simultaneously get more expensive. President Trump's argument is that Americans are willing to suffer short-term pain to stop the scourge of drugs and illicit drugs and illegal migration. That was yet to be determined. I suspect he probably has calculated that most Americans would rather not suffer that pain, and that is why he is postponing the tariff. We'll see what happens in 1 month's time. But again, I want you to understand the full context and the full picture of what's going on. I try to make the class relatable to the events that are going on around us rather than just make the class too abstract. So now that I've addressed the current events and open to taking questions after formal lecture, I'll be glad to take all your questions. Let us then address our learning objectives for the module by interrogating the following learning objectives. The first is explain why trade among nations is beneficial. Now, according to the World Bank, and again, in the weeks ahead, we'll also get to unpack the World Bank so that you understand what it is and what they do. According to the World Bank, whom, again, as I said, you would learn in the weeks ahead, has a stated mission to abolish poverty. The World Bank acknowledges that while all countries have not benefited equally from trade, in part due to domestic political economy challenges, but overall, trade has generated unprecedented prosperity, helping to lift some 1 billion people out of poverty in recent decades. As one example, trade leads to faster productivity growth, especially for sectors and countries engaged in global value chains. I am going to ask everyone to kindly mute their audio. That way their audio doesn't interfere with the lecture. Thank you very much. For least developed countries, or LDC, as they're called in development economics, I should also mention that as we go through each week's lecture, and now that you are a scholar in international trade and global political economy, there are some words and phrases that you must begin to work into your vocabulary, because there are really the technical phrases that you should use when discussing this branch of scholarship. But they also have a signaling effect to your audience that you are really a scholar in the practice of, or in the study of, rather than just a casual observer. The first is the phrase least developed countries, or LDCs. So for least developed countries, or LDCs, will comparative advantage. And again, another critical phrase is comparative advantage. And I'm going to break down comparative advantage with competitive advantage. These are one of those economic terms that you simply must become familiar with for the class and in your professional years ahead. So for least developed countries with comparative advantages, or an economy's ability to produce, and this is comparative advantage, an economy's ability to produce a particular good or service at a lower opportunity cost than its trading partners. This links provides opportunities to specialize in making a single component or input products. So just so you understand the logic here, when you make something, there is the objective cost of making that product. So it might cost you $10 to make a flip-flop. That's the objective cost. There is also an opportunity cost. An opportunity cost is everything else you could have done with that $10. Because money is a finite commodity. If you have $10, you could choose to buy a wonderful dinner with it. You could choose to go to a movie with it. I'm not even sure that I could afford a movie ticket now. Or you could choose to make flip-flops with it. So when you choose to make flip-flops with it, the cost of that flip-flop is not just $10. The cost of that flip-flops is the objective cost plus the opportunity cost of the flip-flops. In this case, the opportunity cost would be the dinner and the movie, because these are the things you gave up so you can make flip-flops. So to enjoy comparative advantage, you have to be better at making something. You being the society or the country have to be better at making something. Whatever that is, you're better off making it than selling it to the rest of the world and importing stuff from other countries. And that is the comparative advantage. So each country ends up making things that it has a specialty in, and then importing the things that it does not have specialty or comparative advantage in. That is the basic logic. So for least developed countries with comparative advantage or an economy's ability to produce a particular good or service at a lower opportunity cost than its trading partner, this leads to provide opportunities to specialize in making a single component or improved products, like a keyboard rather than a finished product, right? So some economies make input products, not the finished product. So if there are any one of us here who know anything about, say, and I just say this because of its proximity to New York City, if you know anything about Jamaica, you will know that Jamaica has a lot of bauxite. And that bauxite is the basic element in making aluminum. So quite often, it is not uncommon for Jamaica, as an example, to import refrigerator or washing machine from China, but export aluminum to China, which China would use as one of the primary components for making dishwashers and washing machines. So that is trade, because Jamaica has a natural resource, which is bauxite, that is the prerequisite for making aluminum. It would make an input product, which is an aluminum, which is a product that you need to be able to make a dishwasher or washing laundry machine. Then it will sell the aluminum to China, and China will then make washing machine with the aluminum and then sell the washing machine, the finished product, to Jamaica. Now, ideally, what Jamaica would want to do in this scenario is to increasingly move its manufacturing base up the value chain, which means at some point, Jamaica would want to start also making washing machine. And China would want to move up the value chain, which is at some point, it wants to give up lower margin and lower scaled manufacturing and go into higher value manufacturing. Maybe it will start making microchips and AI, as China has just announced, right? What ends up happening is that every year we want a raise in our job. But let's imagine for 1 second that we all live in Jamaica and we work for this new company that Jamaica has started that now manufactures washing machines. And every year we want a raise. Eventually, the company is going to have two choices. Either fire all of us because we now make too much money, or increase the price of its washing machine. But if it increases the price of its washing machine, the washing machine might become too expensive that nobody will want to buy that brand anymore, in which case it wouldn't work, right? So that economy would have the choice of trying to move what they call moving up the value chain. And that's when you can say, oh, Jamaicans make so much money, they can't afford to make washing machines anymore. That's why cheap stuff are not made in the United States because we have a minimum wage, right? So if you have to pay people minimum wage and provide them health insurance, you can't go make stuff that is sold in dollar store because you can't make them profitably. So we have to import nearly everything in a dollar store in the United States from China. And eventually, as China's wage rate and purchasing power continues to go up, they will know they will become like us. They will make too much money to be able to, that they can no longer make dollar store stuff profitably. And maybe the production will shift to Vietnam as is happening now. So that is the pure dynamics of comparative advantage and the opportunity cost of making goods. Additionally, consumers in especially advanced economies, and this is key, consumers in especially advanced economies enjoy greater variety of goods and services at lower cost. Although some firms and workers in individual sectors may see their livelihoods at risk due to increased competitive pressure, which is what I just explained. Because we are concentrating on making the things that can, making goods and services that can support our minimum wage. The cheaper things, we import them from China. So that means we could still go buy dollar stuff. Well, I hear the dollar store, there really isn't anything that costs $1 there anymore. But let's just say they still cost $1. That means we could still go to dollar store and go to Dollar General and go to dollar, whatever they're called, and buy dollar stuff. But that's only because they're being imported from China. So we are buying those goods at a lower cost than if those goods were made in the United States. But to be a true scholar, there is also, and this is one of those phrases that I say that you should also understand as a scholar, that is what is called dialectical thinking. Dialectical thinking is that you don't really know an issue until you understand it from both sides. Because there isn't just one side to an economic argument, because there is demand and there is supply. So think about it this way. 25 years ago, maybe even up to 20 years ago, there used to be a huge garment district on the west side of Manhattan. You could go there, buy fabrics, have them made to order, and then you could ship them all over the world and sell the dresses and clothes that have been made out of them. But again, remember that every year we want a raise. And then we have what is called minimum wage. And that's because this is an expensive city. Given this challenges, it became impossible for companies in the garment district of Manhattan to make clothes, make them profitably and competitively. Because by the time you pay the expensive rent in Manhattan, pay minimum wage in Manhattan, pay health insurance for your workers, you're going to have to price that dress a lot more expensive than the competition that is being brought in from China. And what are people going to do? Remember, I just said that consumers in especially advanced economies enjoy a greater variety of goods and services at a lower cost. They are most often going to go to that lower cost goods and save money because the qualities are not dissimilar, so they will go for cost competitiveness. So for the consumer, this is a good thing. But here is the flip side. What about the US worker who used to work in the garment district that is now closing because they can no longer compete from imports from China? For them, this is a disaster. They're going to be opposed to international trade because they're going to say this is bad. It is hurting jobs. It's caused my company to close down. We cannot allow these goods to come into America anymore. We should not allow it. But for the consumer who goes to Temu and buys a dress that they used to go to Atlantic Avenue and buy for $50 and now they can get it for 20 or 15, I see somebody laughing, but because you know it's true. They can go to Temu and get it for 10, $15. That's a win, right? And this is international trade. But that win means that you're no longer going to Flatbush to go buy clothes because it's more expensive on Flatbush. So as you save money, there's also a store that is probably going out of business on Flatbush because it cannot compete with Temu, at least on price and quality. So the second learning objective is to identify the different constituencies within nations that influence trade policies. So despite aforementioned benefits, globalization is under pressure from different constituencies. Traditionally, multinational businesses are champions of international trade or globalization, as they seek global efficiencies to shore up profit margins. Although post-COVID, multinationals are also increasingly considering nearshoring of their operations in an attempt to de-risk supply chains. Let me just very quickly unpack that. Nearshoring. So what used to happen before COVID was that every company, multinational, was trying to find the cheapest source for goods and services. Most often that meant going to China. But it turns out that there is a risk that comes with that. Because once China closed down due to COVID and the ports were closed down due to COVID, we could no longer get goods and services. Even getting PPE for hospitals became difficult. This was a major challenge to global supply chains. So companies are now beginning to realize that maybe they should not always go to the cheapest location. They should perhaps consider going to locations that are cheap, may not be the cheapest, but is close by, so that there will be less disruption. This is part of the reason why Mexico, and no longer Canada, is now America's biggest trade partner. So on the other hand, in particular, unions, on the other hand, would blame globalization for the loss of manufacturing jobs in advanced economies. So again, as I said, there are two sides to it. You get to buy cheap products, but those cheap products are cheap because they're made overseas where wages are lower, environmental regulations tend to be lower, and this almost always are blue-collar jobs that used to have strong union support. So no surprise that unions are not always crazy in support of, not all the time, but a lot of times unions do not support international trade. If you look at the loss of jobs in the U.S. steel sector, that is one example, while unions are not always very receptive to it. So the other learning outcome is to explain the attitudes of different constituencies, labor, business organizations, and household towards trade. Realize labor has a different interest. Businesses or multinationals have a different interest. Households have a different interest. So from the perspective of an advanced economy, which is what the United States is, actually we're the most advanced economy in the world, labor, especially in low-end manufacturing, can be hostile to globalization as production is offshored to low-cost countries. This is true because the first jobs to be shifted overseas are the low-end manufacturing. Because low-end manufacturing, what they make is typically not very expensive. That means you need to keep your costs down for you to sell those products at a cheap price. However, you can only keep costs down so much in the United States because we have minimum wage. You have to provide health benefits. You have to pay utility and pay rent. And these are all fixed costs that are expensive in the United States. So when you move that low-end manufacturing to a developing country where the labor costs and fixed costs are lower, then you would have labor in the low-end manufacturing decrying the negative impact of global trade. Conversely, business organizations, especially multinationals, are natural champions of globalization due to inherent benefits. So multinationals, on the other hand, love global trade because that means they can source the most competitively priced input for their products at whatever country. They're not locked into paying above market price because they're pigeonholed into a particular market. GM builds a lot of cars in Mexico as an example. Because when he builds cars in Mexico, he pays the workers in pesos, not US dollar. So it costs them less to make cars in Mexico, and yet it sells them in America in US dollars. So all things being equal, cars manufactured in Mexico are generally more profitable than cars manufactured in the United States, which is why many of the lower priced GM vehicles, as an example, are often manufactured in Mexico. Because that's the only way GM is General Motors. That's the only way they can keep the cost low enough to be able to sell that car at a low price. Or keep the cost of manufacturing low enough so they can sell the car at a low price. Or relatively low price, because there's really no such thing as a cheap car these days. So household also benefit from competitive pricing on the consumption side. So there is the production side and the sales side, and then there's also the consumption side. Obviously, for the examples that I gave about going to Temu or going to the dollar store. So because these goods are sourced internationally, consumers get to enjoy very good prices, and that's a boon that makes the household budget go even further. So you can see how these three constituencies, labor, multinationals, and consumers, have conflicting attitudes towards globalization and international trade. Yet, tit-for-tat trade disputes and restrictions not only ultimately drive prices higher with associated inflationary pressure, they also weaken the rules-based international trading regime centered on the World Trade Organization. So don't take my word for it that tit-for-tat trade restrictions is when US says it's going to place tariffs on Canadian product imports, then Canada says it's going to place tariffs on US imports. It's tit-for-tat. It's retaliatory. Just don't take my word for it. Even President Trump acknowledges that prices may go up for Americans as a result. So it keeps prices up and distorts the efficient sourcing of goods and services. And that is the consequence of when trade doesn't function optimally. This phenomenon, in part, explains why smaller developing countries cannot be self-sufficient and need to export to import. Furthermore, many developing countries don't have the fiscal resources to counter steps taken by advanced countries to subsidize domestic production, and therefore adding to the need for IMF loan facilities, a topic we shall discuss in the weeks ahead. So the fourth learning objective is to distinguish the advantages and disadvantages of international trade to different groups in a country. International trade offers the global south. So this is another phrase that you must become familiar with. The world is divided into two broad cleavages, global north and global south. Global north is shorthand for the wealthy countries in the Americas and Western Europe. Global south is shorthand for the developing and least developed and underdeveloping countries of Africa, South America, Caribbean, Southeast Asia. So it's called Global North and Global South. Now, there are some countries that are geographically in the Global South that are considered part of the Global North because they're economically very advanced, but those are just a handful. On the other hand, the critical perspective of international political economy centered on client-patron unequal economic relationship would argue that the terms of international trade are too often exploitative of the global south. Additionally, due to weak regulatory regime and cost pressures, industrialization can often lead to pollution in the global south. So here's what this means in a nutshell. Again, extending the logic of the bauxite example that I cited with Jamaica. If Jamaica fails to enact strong regulatory regime, or if Jamaica needs the company that set up the bauxite aluminum plant so much because they create so much employment and generate so much tax revenue for Jamaica, Jamaica will be hesitant to properly regulate that company. And if Jamaica, as in this example, not to say this is happening, but if Jamaica in this example is incapable, unwilling, or unable to sufficiently regulate this company, you could see how this company can begin to pollute the environment in Jamaica because there is a cost to not polluting. And if it has leverage, because it's a big employer and a big tax generator, it can use that leverage to bully the country around. In this instance, rivers and land pollution with associated public health challenges from the garment and shipbreaking industries in countries can begin to damage the environment. Anyone who understands the economy of Bangladesh, as an example, would know that Bangladesh has a major shipbreaking industry, as an example. It is also true that that shipbreaking industry has created significant environmental pollution in the rivers and land around those areas where the shipbreaking occurs. And this is just a classic example of environmental damage that can come as a result of industrialization. So for the global north, international trade lends to efficiency of markets and price competitive products and services, which is what we've discussed all evening. Efficient markets, you could sit in your house, turn on your computer, get into Temu, order your clothes, and boom, it's there, right? And you're buying from the best price. You're just not stuck into overpaying because you're physically in New York City. So you're buying your product from anywhere in the world, and you have that efficiency and price competitiveness. But on the other hand, international trade for global north can also lead to deindustrialization. And this is where understanding an issue from all sides is important. So on the one hand, we have the best competitively priced products. But to get that best pricing, sometimes those industries move overseas. When those industries move overseas, we are deindustrializing. We are losing those industries. And there is a human and economic consequence to deindustrialization because people are going to lose jobs. Families are going to suffer economic harm. The locality is going to suffer less tax revenue because you can pay tax if you're not making income. And more people would likely get on public assistance than would have otherwise been paying taxes. They become net recipients of aid from the government rather than net taxpayers. So the fifth question is research upon and analyze how international trade can enhance economic growth. So we have, in having the conversation all this evening, we have really touched upon the ways international trade make our economies more efficient. I hope I was able to highlight that, but also highlight some of the ways international trade could also hurt us with respect to job losses, with respect to shipping products overseas, and in the context of the global south, potential for exploitation, whether a company becomes so big that it begins to exploit the poorer country. Multinational becomes so big, it begins to exploit the poorer country, up to the point of perhaps environmental pollution and otherwise. And I also mentioned a number of ways that we need to start thinking, and now that you're scholars, the one important thing is understanding that you must engage in dialectical thinking rather than just seeing an issue from one side and then taking a strong position. You want to be able to understand the issue from all sides. And the second thing is to also understand comparative advantage, because comparative advantage is at the heart of why countries trade. You want to concentrate on making the goods that you're good at and importing the goods that you're not very good at making, or at least you cannot make them competitively. So comparative advantage, again, is comparative advantage, again, is an economy's ability to produce a particular good or service at a lower opportunity cost than its trading partners. So next week, we would we'll discuss, the lecture will be on confirming that it will be on managing the global economy. Specifically, we will examine how global trade is managed among nations and review the institutions that have been set up since World War II to manage global trade, their histories, and their different roles. So I'm going to say this for the benefit of those who joined us. By the way, I'm going to end the recording now, and then we will go into Q&A as necessary. Hang on.